All right, here we are. Dr. Goodwin here. Yep, back again. Dr. Goodwin here. I'm here with Nick Iafrate, journeyman of the soul, helping me out on my discussion of Stranger Things today. I've got a lot to talk about today. We're doing a deep dive into this show because I think it encapsulates a lot of stuff to do with fantasy narratives and how they react, how they are reactions to culture. That's the theme. And there's a couple of interesting things about this show in particular that really highlight this. As we've talked about in other videos, there's a thing about fantasy where the imagery is a depiction of something that has a reality to it, that's an inner reality. It can easily get taken literally, and so you miss out on the symbolism if you do that. That's a mistake, though. And they are still about what's going on right now. Like even Lord of the Rings, you think it's a story that's set a bazillion years ago in this fictional world, blah, 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 but it was about the world during 20th century, Europe, and all of the conflict from the world wars and all of that. It was about all of that stuff. It was just written in symbolism and imagery that really speaks to the emotions.
Yeah.
So
as much as
the same thing.
Yeah. As much as Tolkien does not like to admit that, I think his unconscious was definitely coming through with a lot of that stuff. Yeah.
Exactly right. Because you're talking about his famous dismissal of allegory.
Mm-hmm.
But then when he sets up his discussion of allegory, he says that allegory is just this very simple sort of one-to-one correspondence, blah, blah, blah. And who would take that seriously? I agree.
Yeah.
But that's not really allegory. So it's not exactly fair. And he goes on then to say that the symbols in the Lord of the Rings have applicability. And so, okay, Professor.
Yeah.
You're splitting hairs here, sir.
Yeah.
With all due respect. So before I dive into what I think is going on with Stranger Things, I've got a couple of different topics I wanted to discuss with you and bounce ideas off and see what your thoughts were. Overall, like, I love this show. Yeah. I really, really enjoy it, and I'll be able to get into a whole lot of why as we go. But what about you? Do you like it?
Yeah, I kind of at first I think a lot of like the nostalgia pull kind of drew me in, but then I really grew to enjoy it. I mean, I've watched every single season up to this. I know we both have, we've talked about it behind the scenes too, but yeah, it's definitely been a show I've enjoyed. I think we'll get into why season 4 was just so amazing. And I feel like it really was kind of a return to form for the show. But yeah, I absolutely love it. I thought it was great.
So for anyone out there who has never heard of Stranger Things, number one, why in the world are you watching this video? But number two, let me explain. It's this small town in the middle of nowhere. Could be any small town. I think it's in Indiana, Hawkins, Indiana. And these weird things start happening. It centers on these kids that are about 12 and 13 years old in 1983. and they discover there's a secret laboratory, and there's monsters appearing from out of nowhere, and there's this kid with superpowers, and it just sounds completely insane, but they make it work. They really make it work. And it's definitely got loads of nostalgia factor, particularly for me, because I was exactly the same age as Dustin and his pals in 1983. But then I can also see the show through the eyes of the adults, such as the Winona Ryder's character, and Hopper, Joyce Myers and Hopper. I can see it from that show. So, but getting into that, I mean, what is the point of setting this show in the 80s, do you think? Couldn't you tell this story now? I mean,
well, I think the 80s and the early 90s had a lot to offer in terms of fantasy. I think it was kind of maybe like the golden age of a lot of just fantasy material coming out. And I think, well, especially for the Duffer, the Duffer brothers, just like you, they grew up during the 80s. I mean, I was born in the 90s, but all the material that I really enjoyed was from the 80s and the early 90s. But I also think that you could potentially have a show in a modern setting, but I think it having it in the 80s really does attract the adults to it, especially now, but also it's accessible for a younger generation as well.
I have a number of thoughts about this, because I've really pondered that as I've watched the show over the years. I've always thought, what's going on here? Why set this in the 80s? But then I came up with I think an even more important question, which would be, why are we watching a show about the 80s now? Like, what is going on now that's a reflection? Like, I'm always saying that fantastical material and fantasy imagery are responses to what's going on now. And so this is the same thing. Why are we telling a story about the 80s? Well, let's look at the 80s. I was there, and it's funny. I've read that Winona Ryder was keeping them in check sometimes. Like, oh, you guys are playing this song. It didn't come out for 2 more years, so you can, like, she's got this. And of course, she was a big name back then too, right? She was in Beetlejuice, and and she was in that whole crowd of young up and coming super popular actors. Then she kind of faded into obscurity, and then here she is, she's back. And so if you look at the world of the 80s, it's very different from the world now. There was no ubiquitous cell phones or internet, so if you wanted to find out something, you were severely limited in your ability to do so. So there was a whole lot more, you're on your own, right? You can't just look it up on the internet, like Demogorgon monsters in scientific facilities. You can't just Google that and see where you're, proof. So you also have the instant communication of cell phones, which would have made a lot of what happens in the story really difficult to justify. Well, how come they don't just call 911, on their cell phone that everybody has, all that kind of thing. Well, they didn't have them. So that allows the tension to be higher and provides more, drama. But it also heightens what I think is really more important about this, and that is that there was more danger and more tension in that era than there is now for the average kid. There was a whole lot less helicopter parenting going on back in the 80s. I was a latchkey kid, for example. You come home, you find the key, you go in the house, you're on your own. Don't die. That was the attitude. Now, you could say that parents allowed that to happen because they lived in neighborhoods that were more secure and more, safer and all that kind of thing. And I don't know. I think that might be debatable. I mean, there's certainly a whole lot more paranoia nowadays, it seems. But the general impression is that you just can't have 12 and 13-year-olds riding around on their bikes just wherever. Well, now, because we have cell phones, maybe, we have them attached to them at the hip. And so they've got a digital leash no matter where they go. You've got tabs on them. And so, of course, the kids know this, whether they know it consciously or not. It's always in the background that, well, I could just call mom or dad,
Yeah.
and everything would be fine. As opposed to, I'm out here dealing with this crap by myself on a bike, or I've got the bullies chasing after me, right, in the woods, throwing rocks at me and all that kind of jazz. And I'm on my own. I got to deal with this. There's no cell phones. There's none of that stuff. So the parenting was different. There was a different philosophy than there is now. So that, I think, heightens the tension, and also heightens the reason for why we're having an 80s fantasy now. But I'll get into that. I'll get into that later. Thoughts, reflections.
Yeah. I was at the tail end of being able to kind of, I don't want to say being able to kind of do that, but the idea of the majority of your time as a kid is spent outdoors with your friends, and you don't necessarily have a direct line of communication between you and your caregivers, right? So
Right.
I have my own thoughts about what it means now, and how it could potentially be detrimental to not have that,
Right.
not have that kind of certain level of independence as a young kid. But
well, particularly the age that the kids are in the show. There's a reason why we're watching a show about 12-year-olds.
Yeah.
As opposed to if they were 17, the show would not work.
No.
If they were 9 or 7, the show would not work. That age is particularly useful and significant. That's why they picked that. And it just so happened that I happened to be that age at that time. So I really resonate with that.
Right.
Especially because there were a bunch of nerdy kids that were playing Dungeons and Dragons. I was right in there in the middle of it,
Right.
So there's that. But then, of course, at the same time, this kind of story where you have a band of misfits that are kind of social outcasts, they're kind of awkward, they're kind of nerdy, and they have to deal with this existential threat or some kind of demonic threat or whatever it is. This is a very common trope. It's been around for decades. So I think there's something very interesting about that too, about why that story is resonating with so many people now. And I mean, for example, the movie adaptation of It moved everything up to the 80s in the movie adaptation. And the first one was actually quite a bit more successful than the second one, I believe, where they're adults. There's a bunch of reasons for that, which maybe we'll get into that one of these days. But it really works for the first one because of this. You're on your own. You have to deal with this demon clown, and and there's all that, and it's just independent. You don't have constant supervision from the powers that be.
Yeah. Or even acknowledgement from the powers that be.
Yeah, right. In that case, yes, there's a whole lot of neglect.
I see a lot of that kind of transferring over between something like It, where you had an entire town that was just, especially the adults, were just completely oblivious to what was going on. I mean, they were afraid that their children were going missing, but aside from that, they really weren't involved. And then the story was told from this perspective of the children, these innocent, very what are they? They are, they could be, the danger is that much more prevalent, for them. They're very vulnerable.
Right. They're more vulnerable.
So you see that a lot.
Completely helpless.
No.
Which is why that age works so well for that.
Yeah.
For that story and for this one, for Stranger Things. And of course, you can definitely see there's a lot of influence from Stephen King and Steven Spielberg.
Oh yeah.
Probably more Stevens. And they're all there, in the story. So I think that for that particular motif, right, that as it applies to Stranger Things and many stories like it, it's got that business of being the misfit. And I think that probably resonates because so many of us feel like misfits at that age, because we're trying to figure out where our place is, and society doesn't really give us an answer to that. We have to figure it out on our own. I could do a 2-hour rant on that alone, but I won't. But here we are. So you get to age 11, 12, 13, 14, and you're like, what, who am I? How do I fit into the world? That who am I business has even found its way into Disney movies, starting with the 90s. Before that, the main Disney character didn't have a big long song at the beginning about who am I, right? But then after, once the Little Mermaid comes along, it's who am I, who am I, who am I? Every single one of them had a song at the beginning of a who am I don't know who I am.
Right.
You know, and it's almost laughable. You know, like, oh, there they go. I think in Mulan, it was like she literally asked that question, who is this girl I see in the mirror? You know?
Yeah.
Like, well, that's a little on the nose, but okay, we'll go with it. It's great.
Hercules at I will find my way.
I will find my way.
Yeah,
yes, that's right.
I
Who
love
am
that
I?
one. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, same with Aladdin, so forth and so on. And then Tangled, which was quite a few years later, still doing the same thing, right? So there must be a question that many young people are asking themselves. I think that's obvious, or maybe it's not so obvious. But then casting your heroes as a bunch of misfits, you're going to get a whole lot of people on board already right there, because they know that feeling. I did too, absolutely. That was before I became awesome, you know. And so anyway, so they're dealing with all these challenges. They're confused about their place in the world. They are growing at an astronomical rate. So there's a lot of changes happening, and we know physiologically, biologically, the body and the mind and the brain and all that is just going through massive changes, right? You get these huge hormonal surges, and there's lots of pruning and growing and all this stuff going on in the brain. So, you know, I think that's where this whole business of the awakening powers business comes from in these kinds of stories. We see this in the 11 character, which I'll get to her. But all that is in the context of this evil that is emerging from the shadows, right? So Stranger Things it fits right into this mold. And but I'm curious as to what you think about the character of 11 in all of this, right? It's not unique to have a character like her in a story like this, but I think she's integral to this show. But what do you think?
Well, I think there are a lot of common tropes with having this kind of, I don't want to call her, I mean, she is kind of the one, right? In this story. She's not the singular hero, because there is the town of Hawkins, the community around her, Jim, her friends, all of that. But this idea that the hero is directly associated with the darkness, right? Yeah. And those two things going hand in hand. So with the coming of the hero is the coming of the darkness. So those two things are connected. And you know, so far throughout the series, the kind of common tropes of her realizing her kind of potential, losing it coming back again in order for her to kind of prepare for the final battle, all that stuff. I think it's a great character. I think I really enjoyed what they did with 11 in terms of just showing her as as not only as a conflicted character, but almost an alien of sorts. Yeah, I get a lot of like that kind of Superman type stuff going on where she is, I mean, she's human, but she has no idea who she is. She has no idea about the modern world or the world around her, for that matter. So her initial introduction is with the gang.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think the show would work without that character?
I think it could. I don't know what. I think it could work, but really at that point, what's going on here? Hold on. All right, we're back. Yeah, no, I think it could work. But what about you?
I think it would work considerably less well without that character. I think that she's kind of the heart and the soul of the story. And that she is an embodiment of the changes that the other characters are going through. She's an extreme, a picture of how what they're going through is happening to all the other characters, right? So not only is they are misfits, but she's an alien almost, you know. They're having new, you know, talents and skills, and they're growing and everything, and she's literally getting more superpowers,
right?
Or her superpowers are increasing in their intensity. She is trying to figure out her place in the entire planet, right? And this is an aspect of the whole chosen one motif, which I want to do a whole separate video on that, and why that one is so common. It's been around forever, but it's really common now. So I think she's there to show us, exactly what the other characters are going through in pictures, rather than just hints and nuance and that kind of thing. This is fantasy, right? So we can depict these things using fantastical images. So like you say, she gains this power. She tries, kind of figures out her place in the society very slowly over the first couple of seasons. And then she loses her uniqueness as she's more assimilated, right? So there's a whole lot of this individual versus society stuff in her character, in all of them, but in her in particular. Then she regains her uniqueness again. But then there's also the connection between her and Vecna, which they really emphasize in this season. Yeah. So now that's an interesting bit of world building that they've done there.
Yeah.
And in the sense that not only is she the chosen one, but she created the Upside Down in her battle with One. Now, what's your thoughts about One as a villain?
Oh, I love Vecna. Yeah, I think the reason why season 4 was so good was because of the villain.
Oh, well, how many times have we said that?
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, you have One, and then you have 1-1, right? 11, 1 and 11. I think there's a lot of kind of parallels between the two. I mean, clearly they're both these super powered beings, or humans. I think Vecna really is what, if 11 decided to take that extra step in terms of saying, I am, instead of 11 being really more focused on kind of integrating herself with the world around her, even though it is different, right? In some way. If she were to say, no, I am separate, and then really embody that, she could potentially go down the road of where Vecna is.
Right. I mean, that's the difference between someone who figures out their place in the world and society versus someone who becomes Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yep. Yeah.
Or any number of those sorts of people that they just don't care. They don't play a part in society. They only victimize.
Yeah.
And so these stories are kind of telling us the perennial question, like, why in the hell do people become serial killers, and why do they do this stuff? What's up with antisocial traits like that?
Yeah.
And the answer in imagery is that it begins in trauma and separation experiences. Both 1 and 11 had the same kind of family separation trauma. They were both subject to this dehumanizing laboratory environment that treats them like lab rats. They're both given this phony baloney guy who they have to call Papa, who is clearly doesn't have their best interest in mind. He's using them. So his instrumental treatment of them is something they share as well. And in fact, he uses that and manipulates their emotions deliberately. It's very dark stuff that he's involved with, which makes for an interesting ending for him when he finally dies. And they really sold the complexity of that character as well, right? He's not pure evil, but he's definitely not good.
No.
So right, so they both endure that same sort of thing. They both deal with that same kind of treatment. They're both the chosen one. They both have that special quality to them that the universe has decided that is appointed to them to have this power to do something with. And just like every chosen one motif, there's always a critical point at which the chosen one character has to decide to be good or evil. Are they going to sway the universe one way or the other, right? That's the whole point of the destiny of the chosen one. And unlike 1, she decides that she's not going to use her power to further her own ends and kill everybody. He does that and winds up then in conflict. They two characters fight each other. but she turns out to be more powerful, and her power is connected to her emotions, which is no coincidence, and banishes him to the Upside Down. When I first watched that, I thought, did she just banish him to it? Was it already there, or did she create it? Apparently online, with interviews and things, the intention was to say that she actually created the Upside Down with this, but I'm not sure about that.
Well, the monsters were already there, right? The mind
Well,
flayer,
that's what
the
I
Big
thought.
Horn,
Yeah.
they were already there. So it's definitely a different plane of existence. I don't think she actually created it, but I think that potentially their gifts are associated with this nether dimension. Yeah.
Right. And I thought it makes sense either way, really, psychologically. But to me, it makes a little more sense to think of it as a place that was already there.
Yeah.
Because I see, well, we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
We'll get to that.
Right.
All right. Back to Vecna again. Yeah, I think it's interesting that, once he's banished to it, and he just leans into the idea, I'm going to be pure evil. I'm going to victimize people. I'm going to parasitize them, absorb their essence, and become this sort of hive mind thing. All that.
Yeah.
So the Upside Down becomes organized under his power.
Yeah.
So then he becomes the dark reflection of 1, or of 11. Excuse me, of 11. So you could ask the question: who is the monster? The victim or the traumatizer?
Well, so Vecna, I mean, he had a family. Like I think there was this idea that even though he did have these gifts, that he was still somehow, he over-identified with the gifts in and of themselves. He was inflated by them to the extent where he said, I am the predator. I am the Black Widow. I am misunderstood. I am the creature in the dark that has to kind of, that will incite fear into those that are weaker than I am, right? It's a very kind of it's Darwinism taken to the kind of all the way.
Forget altruism.
Forget care. So like, whereas if 11 was in his situation, I don't think she would go as far as murdering her entire family.
Right.
So I don't think he's a victim at all. I think he's through and through. It's interesting. I think it's interesting that they placed his, he was coming of age in the 50s, right? 50s and early 60s. I don't think that's a mistake, because that was a time, just like the 80s, we're kind of talking about the relevance there. 50s were this very kind of white picket fence, like you got to adhere to that culture. You're in it, right? So I think that's chosen for a reason.
The pressure to conform was very high, because we had this, the 50s was all of the Red Scare and the paranoia, and the rebelliousness of the 20s was suddenly looked down upon as subversive, and it's going to make us weak and vulnerable to invasion and the commies and all of that stuff. So the pressure, at least to middle class America, became very high to conform.
It's also not to say that the culture was at fault in terms of him becoming a homicidal, kind of man.
Right. Yeah. No, it's not that easy.
Yeah.
If only it were that easy.
Yeah. Right.
All right. So he had his part to play, his choice to play there.
Yeah.
And so that's a good point. He was separated, but not in the very brutal, sort of traumatic way that 11 was. Yeah. And yet she winds up being the good guy.
Right.
Yeah. As opposed to Vecna. Now, I think if they had having him choose to become evil there is an interesting choice. I wonder what it would have looked like if they hadn't quite done it like that and had him choose to be evil later on, like while he was in the institution there. I think that might have made the point they were maybe trying to make with that a little bit better, but that could be just me projecting onto the story.
Well, he at one point, I mean, I think his relationship with Papa is probably, it really just compounded. It really just made it more prevalent for him.
Oh, absolutely, because he would torture him.
Yeah, exactly. but at the end, when 11 is in his kind of mindscape place, you know, his matrix,
whatever it is.
yeah, he literally says like, no, I'm the monster. Like I am. He fully identifies with that
Right.
kind of that complex idea that I'm not human. I'm not, there's no care here. There's none of that. It is pure predatory rage.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah.
And there's another element to him too that we'll get into a little bit later. But I wanted your thoughts on what do you think the upside down is? And I don't mean necessarily what is it in the story, because I think they'll probably come up with some explanation for it. But psychologically, it's a symbol for, what do you think?
Well, if their powers are directly associated with the upside down, I would say it's a kind of symbol for the unconscious in some way.
Yeah.
Maybe this idea, it's a more Jungian idea in terms of like the shadow or the id, even like being a repository for all like the maybe not a repository, that's probably not a good word for it, but it's a place where demons lie, you know, where the scary things are. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think you could even say a little bit more precisely that it's it's what the unconscious looks like to a person who has had a lot of trauma,
yeah,
and conflict happen to them. And so when you look at it that way, it makes a whole lot of sense. If you look at the characters as internal dynamics, which, you know, that's the usual Jungian trick to do, is to look at this as if it were a dream. Say, what is this a picture of someone's psyche? Well, let's say it's of 11's. Well, what does she do with one? She banishes him to the unconscious. She represses him.
Yeah.
And that makes him more powerful and more demonic and more monstrous. If we look at the two as versions of each other or reflections of each other. If we look at 11 as the person she could be, should she decide to be good, Vecna is the person that she could be should she decide to be evil. And they're completely split apart.
Yeah.
In that big conflict there. And in fact, there's dissociation that happens immediately after.
Yeah.
She forgets, like she's in a coma, and then she forgets the last 2 years and all that kind of thing, which helps explain, you know, her behavior in season 1. It's great, great retcon, like very, very well done. There's a good way to do this, Hollywood. This is it.
Yeah.
Right. BS retcons, not gonna work. All right. Okay, but this one works.
That's a really good point you bring up, though. It just in terms of like the symbolic imagery in and of itself, like that trauma, like literally creating a doorway between two worlds.
Yeah.
Him going in, and then that traumatic repression, and then her just forgetting about it immediately.
Well,
that's
and
a
the
really
unconscious, right? And the unconscious has this protean nature to it. It's Janus phased, right? As I know we've talked about this before. It has its own characteristics and its own sort of ancient qualities, but it also reflects what you are, what the ego projects onto it. And that's the danger, right? You have to watch out for that.
Yeah.
If you take it literally and you project what, you know, the ego projects into it, then you've got internal projection, right? That's not good. But it does happen because it will respond to, it's a picture of your perception of the world. So if I'm afraid, if I have a lot of anxiety, I may dream about monsters chasing me. But those monsters are reflections of my fear. If I say become lucid, right, or train myself to do this, I can turn around and face those monsters, and they change shape into something not scary anymore. So that characteristic of the unconscious is here too.
Yeah.
It looks like a hellscape because that's inside her mind. That's what it would look like after all of that horrible trauma, that dehumanizing treatment by Papa, and all the confusion. Plus, she in this season here, she gets bullied by these, you know, brats with too much hairspray and all that kind of crap. So, you know, the external world gets reflected into the internal world, and that's hellscape is what it looks like.
Right. Yeah.
So, okay, so there's another theme that goes on here in this story too. There's a couple of different themes. Number one is I've got 4 main observations about this, just the story structure and and how other ways that other stories reflect this kind of similar theme. And then we'll dive more into like what makes the show so popular. But first is, I think the 11's treatment is kind of a very extreme sort of way that we treat gifted children in our society. Now that's a bit of a hot take, but think about this. All right. It's early on noted that she has some kind of special quality to her. So what do? We squirrel her away. We have her focus solely on the gifts.
Yeah.
To the exclusion of social connection and love and care and just being a regular person. And now she's severely deprived of that to focus solely on her power. Now that's very extreme, but this is what we do with gifted children in some settings, particularly in middle class and upper class settings. I think they're probably more relaxed in upper class settings because you get all this cash flowing, and it doesn't really matter if you're a schmuck, you're still going to be rich. But in the middle class, you've got pressure on you to achieve, to perform, to do better than the previous generation, et cetera, et cetera. If you're in the lower class, you're never going to get squat. The whole system's rigged against you. So there's less of that there either. So this is a middle class issue, right? And it's no mistake that all these stories are set in suburbia, USA. Same thing. So here we've got this, and this is the first time I've seen this example of this particular motif of targeting this. This is the way we deal with this, gifted children. Right? We basically take away their whole identity, and it's not intentional, I don't think. And it's probably not as bad as it once was, but this maybe you might even say this is a cautionary tale. This is like what happens if you're not careful and you focus too much on achievement and too much on their gifts and all that kind of stuff, and you don't let them just be a kid.
Yeah. Well, in 11's case, it's her gifts are being used for again the means of an institution, a government institution, right?
Big faceless organization.
Yeah, it's not about her, right? And it's not about care. It's not about love. It's not about a kind of naturalistic upbringing. Excuse me. It's about how can we draw out and vampirically just suck out everything that makes her unique and use it for our own means.
Yeah. And to hell with what you want to do with it.
Yeah. And it's funny that they call, what is his last name? Dr. Papa.
Brenner?
Brenner, they call him Papa, right? This kind of surrogate father of sorts that is very much this kind of tyrannical. He's a tyrannical father. He's not really in it. And you mentioned his death later on, and like he's really he's like, I need you to tell me that you understand, right? I need you to tell me that you understand. But no, he was the face of this kind of faux paternal figure that in reality was just a facade for something that was very sterile and nefarious, malicious.
We're basically going to use you to further the ends of the many, and we don't really care whether you like it or not, right? So it's forced altruism, right? That's not how altruism is supposed to work. And that's what a lot of these stories, and especially stories involve the chosen one character, end up being about. It's done. I've seen it done very well, like in this story, and I've seen it done very poorly, like in, say, X-Men Origins, Wolverine. All right, really dumb movie.
That movie. Oh, it had so much potential.
It did. I mean, Hugh Jackman is not to be blamed here because the script was so goofy. But again, it's the same idea. We're going to use you to further the government ends, and of course, he fights against them, and he becomes a problem. Blah blah blah. Right? We've seen all this stuff. And if it's done poorly, you notice that you've seen this thing done a million times. If it's done well, it sneaks under the radar, like here, where she's still got the same issue. She's got the same issue as Wolverine. She's been practically created by this institution, and they want to use her. And what does she do? It backfires on them because she has a mind of her own, and she fights against them and kills half of them and all this kind of stuff. But we don't notice that because it's just done so much better. It's done, and I hate it when people say that kind of stuff. It's just better. Okay, well, why? What's better about it? I think it's done better here because it's more organic. They get us to actually care about her. and they make the other characters surrounding her complex and believable. So like even Dr. Brenner, you can kind of see that he feels like the end justifies the means, that he's not entirely pleased about all the stuff he has up, he ends up doing, but he honestly thinks he has no choice.
Yeah.
And you kind of hate him, but at the same time, it's sort of like it would be too easy to say he's just pure evil and he's just doing it because he's getting his jollies off, right? I don't get that. That's why that scene at the end is so important. I need you to understand this. I need this. And she wouldn't give it to him, which is the appropriate answer. It's like, no, I'm not going to gratify that, right? You haven't earned that. And so that was gratifying to see that play out between the two of them, because they definitely, if they hadn't had that scene, it would have diminished it.
Yeah.
You would have had that dangling, that whole relationship between her and him. There was so much to it going on. You genuinely think that she feels for him, like she cares about him and feels like he's a father figure. She wants to please him, and he's just using that for her. Use it not for her, but for his own, agenda. And
it's like a commentary on, and as you're talking, I'm just like, no, this makes sense. So it's a commentary on what you would consider a kind of false maybe not artificial, but a faux collective, kind of institution, right? And that really gave kind of credence to Vecna becoming who he was. He used that in that example as like, no, I'm absolutely right here. I'm absolutely right that everybody is crap. Like it's all about survival of the fittest. I'm at the top of the food chain. That, and the other. Whereas for 11, that was an experience of no. This is not something that might necessarily be true for everything and everyone. But then she found family, true family, outside of that. She found what she was looking for to a certain degree. So
another example of this done well is in Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Almost exactly the same plot structure, really. At least particularly surrounding the chosen one characters, right? So Harry Potter, he went through the same baloney that Voldemort did, all that stuff, right? And yet Voldemort decides that he's going to go down the dark path and be only concerned about himself and dominating others at their expense. And then Harry Potter obviously chooses, no, I care about my friends and I'm going to lean on that strength. And especially in the fifth one, the end scenes there in the movie, and the book does as well too. But in the movie in particular, the imagery they chose to have Harry, who is fighting off being possessed by Voldemort, which makes perfect sense when you see it this way. And he fends it off with images of his friends. And then he winds up saying, I pity you.
Yeah.
And that's the only way to really deal with this kind of victimizers out there in the world, inner or outer. If you endlessly cling to rage against them, it just ends up eating you up inside. Not that it isn't justified, of course it is, but it can't go on indefinitely, or else it just harms you. And what's the point of that, right? Instead, I think you have to wind up with pity, as transforming that rage into pity. But that's a whole other discussion. Again, we're getting a little off track here. And so that is how it ends up being against Brenner. The anger that she would have directed against him, she overcomes it by transforming her anger with him to pity, and then it's, I'm not giving you anything else. I pity you. You're sad, right? They don't have a big long conversation about it, but the actors are able to bring that about because it's so good, So we, and then there's the chosen one motif that we talked about a little bit, and I'll get into more of that later. The third one is is another theme that I see in series where we're transitioning from the beginning of the story is more playful and a little bit sillier, and then gradually it slowly becomes more serious and more and darker and higher stakes and all that. Now, I think that the storytellers do that because it increases the tension as you go, but it works effectively, really well, particularly well in stories that center on children.
Yeah.
Harry Potter did this too. it started off as kind of a fun, whimsical fantasy, and then it got more serious as they went. Well, the kids are getting older as they follow along the story. So life is getting more serious. Life is getting higher stakes. So it follows with them. If they'd stayed in the silly mode, they would have lost, the kids would have aged out of that. But because it follows with you, it works. And you see this in anime all the time, particularly ones that have gone on for years. The ones that are particularly like the shonen types that are aimed at adolescent boys.
Right.
I'm thinking like Demon Slayer or Full Metal Alchemist. I see this pattern over and over again. At the beginning episodes, the comedy and the silliness is cranked up to 1,000. And then that kind of fades into the background, and the more serious elements of the story kick in. The seeds of them are there at the beginning. You've still got some pretty serious and dark themes, which 12 and 13-year-olds are ready to handle that kind of stuff, but not too much. Not too much. They lighten it with some silly levity and jokes and things. But then as they go, they don't have to spoon feed them that anymore. They can hit them with the harder, darker stuff, and they can handle it. And so it's, in a way, it's kind of, I don't know if they deliberately do this or if it's just because raising the stakes works generally in a series. But it's maybe one of the reasons why it grabs onto young people and the young at heart as well. They can think back, oh yeah, I was like that. And then the fourth observation about this story structure is the motif of the team coming together to defeat the great evil. You've got that story, and it's interspersed with teen relationship drama stuff. Right, I've seen that done many times in animated superhero shows like Arrow. They did this. It drove me crazy. I just couldn't go on past I think maybe the 4th or 5th season. It's like, I can't stand any more of this. I don't care about who's going out with who stuff. I just don't care. But they do this. And now, what do you think's going on there?
Well, I think it's a coming of age, right? And I think that the kind of the teen drama it adds another level of just narrative weight, right? It allows the kind of creators to say, yeah, there's extra emotional dynamics going on, but it builds up those characters, and then also the kind of the intensity of the situation. It says, okay, not only are we kind of building these relationships with each other, but those might be in even more jeopardy, right? It adds more kind of vulnerability for them.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really important, especially, and I know you mentioned it earlier, but again, like the decision to kind of start a story around a group of, pre-teens and adolescents, and then seeing that coming of age, it's like, well, there's a whole lot of stuff going on biologically, a whole lot of stuff going on psychologically, a whole lot of stuff going on socially. And then you have that added layer of an external threat. It just, it works, right? It works. And I think they made it their own, but it's the same as a lot of Spielberg stuff. It's dense, it makes it work, and it gives the audience the ability to say, oh yeah, well, when I was going through that age, that was a very tumultuous, kind of intense time for me. So it makes sense.
Yeah, and if it only really works if you look at the fantastical world ending cataclysmic stuff as some more symbolic of what's going on internally. Because otherwise it's like, okay, we got this evil entity that's about to break into the world and take over the whole country and turn them all into mindless, monsters or mind flayers or whatever it is. But will you go out with me Friday?
Right.
I mean, come on. Yeah. What the hell are you thinking about that for? Now, I think it's funny that the Duffer Brothers apparently are aware of this, because they interspersed, and particularly this season, they had this, why are you talking about that stuff? The characters are basically expressing what I just said a minute ago. Why are we talking about that? We got bigger fish to fry,
Right.
And yet they still do it anyway, right? They still have these long, scenes about characters and oh, I love you, and then all that stuff. And, it works.
Well, when it comes down to it, that is the most important stuff, right? Like in a way, like I was talking to a couple friends about this who also watch the show, but in every single fantasy narrative, in everything that we've talked about since we were kids or really enjoyed, at the core of it, it's about like, oh, that person ended up with that person. It's about the relationships of all these characters. And that's what makes it so much, that's what makes it human. Because if it was just, all right, we need to come together type stuff, and there were no, the interdynamics of the relationships were somewhat superficial, or they weren't there at all, stories wouldn't work at all.
That's true. It gives it a whole lot more emotional weight.
Yeah.
It gives us a reason to give a crap whether or not
Yeah.
they survive, because, oh, well, but they really feel strongly about each other. And we all can feel that. And that's just care, and in some cases lust thrown in there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That. Blended in together with all the other emotional engines firing on all the different cylinders, But I think if you were to look at this in a realistic manner, right, if you're really going to take this literally, and you've got monsters, demons, and all this stuff, I think that stuff would probably be in the background. It would be there, but you can't show that on a show, right? You can't do that very effectively. So you got to give them the scenes where they express their feelings, so the audience knows that what's at stake here is not just, I don't want to die, but I want to make it through here so I can, be with my boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, because that's what it's all about, right? It's like life. It's what we want to do, is live.
Right. If the existential threat is so existential that it might kind of decimate you to the extent where, and I know this sounds Freudian, but you can't procreate anymore, right?
Yeah.
It's done.
No, that's true. All right. And Freud was right about that. That's a major player. It's not, he reduced everything to that, and which is where he made his mistake.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that what he uncovered wasn't important. It definitely is. Okay. So here's the big question, right? This will carry us on who knows how long. Why is this kind of show so popular? This kind of show, right, where you center on these kids and they're going through all this crap, evil monsters and so forth. It's been around for a while, but I think it really got going in the 80s, and obviously it's stronger than ever, to the point that we're recreating the 80s to tell the same kind of story and set it at that time frame. Well, what's going on there, do you think?
I think there's certain things that we look back to and we're saying, okay, there were definitely some truths there, especially for these creators who lived through that. So like, oh, there's something real here that maybe we need to kind of reevaluate, whether they're conscious of it or not, that we need to bring into the now to have a kind of fanciful meta kind of commentary on what those truths are. And I think that really is what, if you want to kind of call fantasy, like we were talking about earlier, it has to somewhat be allegorical, but that's not necessarily a pejorative thing, a negative thing.
No, of course not. We just need to know it for what it is, right? The inner world has its own rules, and they go by the rules of symbol and metaphor and emotion. The external world doesn't operate that way.
No.
Not at all. So, but the internal world is generated by the psyche, the genome, if you will, to engage with the external world. So we gotta be able to understand both languages. It is interesting though. You mentioned the creators of the show. They're in their 30s.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they were born in the 80s. So they don't remember the 80s.
Oh, wow. All right.
Which is probably why they had people like Winona Ryder, who is more my age.
Yeah, checking those boxes.
Checking the box, like
okay. All right.
The actor who plays Hopper too, I can't remember his name, but he's that age too.
Got it.
He was like 74, 75. So, but they nail it. But then it brings us back to the question of why did they set it in the 80s, since they weren't alive during the 80s. So that was a conscious choice, and they clearly had very good reasons for doing that, and that probably they're aware of as well. So much of storytelling is intuitive, right? So I don't want to ever assume that the decisions were made consciously necessarily.
Yeah, right.
And if they weren't, or even if they were, they're going to follow unconscious dynamics and emotional rules, if you will, storytelling, motifs and things like that, archetypal patterns, if you want to go down that road. Yeah. So, okay. So in order to give you a feel for why I think this kind of story is so popular, I'm going to take you back to the ancient times, right?
All right. All right.
Think about like Viking raiders, ancient hunter-gatherers, you know, the Niue people of North America, or any of the number of tribes, the Maori, who knows, any of these folks, every night they would come, if every night, imagine them coming home every night and listening to stories of people hunting and raiding and fishing and exploring and foraging. Why would they need that? They do it all day long. They wouldn't do that. Instead, they would listen to stories of the ancient heroes of old, right? Or gods, that kind of thing, their ancestors or the distant origins and all that kind of thing. In these kind of tribal structures, there's nowhere near as much global oversight. There's not a gigantic centralized bureaucratic institution of the government. There's not even an executive branch, right? So law and order is on you. Survival is on you and your tribe. So, I mean, they're very much closer connected. Their activities were very much closer connected to their survival.
Mhm.
Now, you can say that's good or bad. That's not my point. My point is that we evolved in that situation. So our psyche, our bodies, our minds are geared towards conflict. We're expecting conflict, kind of like a fish expects water. We expect there to be conflict. A great example of this is the immune system, which I'm always going on and on about how the psyche and the immune system follow the same kind of patterns. Like, I think the immune system is a great metaphor for the psyche. There's a lot of talk now that part of the problem with so many more autoimmune disorders in modern society has to do with the fact that we don't challenge ourselves with as much dirt as was seen in the ancestral environment. And there's a number of particular bacteria that we call old friends because they've been around with humans since the beginning of Homo sapiens. They're benign bacteria. They live on the skin and you know, different organs, but they seem to tweak the immune system. But in the modern society that's so much more sterile and removed from natural environments with dirt and crud, the immune system doesn't get that tweaking, and so it goes rogue. I mean, the immune system is a perfect example of a system that is designed to fight. So it's primed for conflict and war. If you don't give it a war to fight, it'll make up one, and it'll start attacking the organs. It'll create allergies, it create, you know, lupus and all this. There is even quite a bit of good evidence to suggest that depression might be partly autoimmune in origin.
Oh, I'm sure.
So psychoneuroimmunology, it's all connected. Now, let's take the modern society. Okay, we've got kids are ultra connected to each other. Every minute of their day is accounted for the most part. There's no common enemies really in our world. There's a lot of petty infighting between individuals, but even that's mainly accounted for by the executive branch, right? If it gets too escalated, you call the cops and they come in and deal with it, you know, theoretically. If you were to look at, say, the Viking culture, I use that example a lot because I've read a lot about it, but it applies to any sort of pastoral culture where there's lots of warfare and things like that. If you know, the Icelandic sagas are full of you know, Olaf came over and took one of my cows, and there's really no recourse. So you can't call the cops. So what does he do? Sven grabs up his sword and goes, kills Olaf, takes the cow back. All right, that's just how things work. Now, you know, what the problem with a system like that, and I don't want to idealize that or you know, fetishize that. The problem with it is you end up with cycles of violence. You end up with blood feuds and that kind of stuff. It goes on forever and ever. They tried to deal with that with things like Weregild and all that. But the point is that it was on you. If you want a justice, you got to get out there and do it yourself. Well, who does that sound like? Batman, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
And a number of these other characters, right? So the desire is there. It's still in there. But the culture well-intended or maybe not, I don't know, has taken that away. Now, that's good because we get less conflict, we get less chaos and mayhem and those cycles of violence, for the most part, not like they had. But is it a perfect system? No. What did we sacrifice anything to get that? Maybe. So, and even just look at like in poor areas where there's gangs. Well, kids are drawn into those gangs for a reason. They provide you with identity. They provide you with purpose. There's a hierarchy. I mean, it's very dangerous and very toxic, but you're engaged at that point, and your survival and what you do matters, as far as like killing the rival gangs and all that, right? It's very much like the no executive branch situations that you had in history, only it's now in a modern urban environment, and nobody cares because they're all poor, right? So that's why there's not much present there, but there's a whole lot of other factors going into that. But anyway, the point I'm making here is that our modern society is pretty, it's kind of really bereft of major life-threatening conflicts. You don't have a whole lot of important goals. You don't have to struggle against invaders or the elements, really. So there's not a whole lot for our passion for life to invest in, to the degree. Now, I'm not going to say there's nothing to invest in because that's obviously false, but there's not to the degree, right? You're just not pushed to the limit like you would in a different time period in the past. There's also the disconnection with nature, which we've had a lot of discussion about that, and what insidious effects that might have. So that would imply that people who are put into environments where they're in danger, where they have to depend on their close allies to survive, that they're on a serious mission that has stakes and consequences and urgency and all that kind of thing, that they would probably feel more alive and more engaged in those settings. And that is exactly what I found with the veterans coming back from combat situations in the military. And I'm not the first person to say this either. It's just well known that war veterans will very often say that was the time they felt most alive. I've talked to Vietnam vets that have told me this, Iraq, Afghanistan, over and over again. I hear this. They come back and they're like, they want to go back. I'm like, you almost got blown to pieces there. What the heck? And they recognize that, and a lot of times they feel bad about it too. Like, I know it sounds crazy, like, shouldn't think that, right? And I'm like, well, hold on now. There's a reason why you're feeling that way. Okay. So what's going on with that? What are your thoughts? I've talked a lot. What do you think?
I agree 100%. I think that there's a kind of, I know we've talked about a lot of positivistic idea that we need to bring society to the extent that there's almost this kind of transcending our experience, transcending our human nature type thing going on. It's been going on for a very long time, and it's had different iterations in terms of that coming from a kind of either somewhat religious perspective or even somewhat kind of secular perspective too. I mean, you and I have talked kind of behind the scenes about transhumanism and whatnot. So I think that it makes complete sense. I don't fetishize or idolize what the past was in terms of what you're talking about. I think that in and of itself is dangerous, because here's the thing: being in a consistent state of just conflict anxiety and being consistent, it's not healthy. It's not ideal.
And we know that from people who have suffered from chronic trauma. Right. This is not to suggest, neither one of us are suggesting that modern world is perfectly safe and no one ever is traumatized. No. In some ways, I think our modern world actually, it makes it easier for sexual predators and for parental abusers to do what they do, because there's so little connection and
absolutely.
But outside of that, and I will say that a whole lot of this superhero stuff is about trauma, and a whole lot of the fantasy stuff that we deal with is about trauma. So there is that, but it's inner trauma, it's family trauma, it's people that we're supposed to trust trauma. It's not the enemy out there that gets projected, And that, I think, is the fantastical element of a lot of these stories, that it's almost like we wish there was an enemy out there, so we wouldn't have any reason to turn on each other.
Yeah.
And that energy, that the immune system will to fight and engage in the battle, wouldn't have to turn inwardly. It could turn outwardly.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And that's one of the dark sides of human nature that maybe we don't want to talk about, but that's there, I think.
Yeah. Well, what is the message with Stranger Things, if not that they have to come together for a purpose, right? It is very much, it's all right, whether we're coming together, we're in a small tribe and we're going out and we need to get food. We need to kind of build up boundaries so we have some level of safety. We need to build shelter and we need to do this, that, and the other. There's common purpose there. And just like with this, and I think what you're talking about in terms of fantasy is that you take that reality of where we've come from and in terms of human evolution, and then we just kind of make it into this fantastical thing that is equally as true in terms of our experience.
That is mainly where I'm going, but we'll get to there.
All right.
More build up here.
Jumping the gun.
Yeah, you're moving ahead quick. So like talking about the soldiers, right? So if you look at what, especially the ones that engaged in they were in a lot of combat. That setting mimics in many ways the ancient tribal experience. You're on a mission, you're with a small band of hunters, warriors. I mean, not every hunter-gatherer tribe involved in a lot of warfare, but there was always hunting. And, you go out there, and if you win, you eat, right? You celebrate. It's a great victory. If you don't, then your stomach rumbles, right? So there's stakes. They're real, and they're dependent on your actions, right? You can't just get out of that. Same thing for the soldiers, right? They have to go out there. They have to accomplish the mission. They got people trying to kill them. They got to kill them first. I mean, it's very heightened. It might be even more extreme than what ancient humans engaged in. There was this cooperative action towards a common goal, had high stakes, high urgency. The bonds of friendship formed in this environment were among the strongest that I've ever seen. That, band of brothers, to quote Shakespeare, is very powerful. And I don't want to make this an entirely male discussion either, because the women that were involved in all this too. There was very real death in childbirth fears. There was foraging provided a vast majority of the calorie intake, right? It wasn't all about the hunters, right? The forages that mostly the women would engage in was super important. And if you don't find it, guess what? You're in trouble. You don't have no food. That's bad. So all that stuff that engages all of the evolutionary tricks that we have evolved over the years to survive are going to be engaged by that environment. We're designed to encounter it. The brain and the body have mechanisms in place to fire it up when it's triggered. An example, I think I've talked about this before, is the brain-derived neurotrophic factor example. It's a hormone in the brain that is responsible for sharpening cognition, improving memory, expanding neural proliferation, healing injuries in the brain, all that, resilience. Now, you might ask, well, how come we don't just have that on maximum 24/7, right? It sounds like it's all good. But because nature is conservative, it's going to use as much as it needs and conserve energy otherwise, because that's a strategy that works better in the long run. So that's what we're equipped with. This applies to pretty much every homeostatic system in the entire body. Psyche's no different. So if we don't need that stuff, it won't engage. And so what triggers BDNF is intense mental puzzle solving activity, like learning new languages, trying to solve a difficult challenge or puzzle, exercise. So it's not just mental, it's physical too, and intermittent fasting. That makes sense though, doesn't it? If you're running into an insecure food source, well, you better crank up your brain capacity to go get some more food, figure it out.
Right.
right? So the genome says, well, you got this big ass brain, do something with it, crank it up, right? Go out there and do something. But if everything just is there and there's not a whole lot to engage that, then atrophy ensues.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, that's a hypothesis, but
If you don't use it,
you lose it. Exactly. Yeah. And you see that with deconditioning in the physical body.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
the mind's the same way. Why
Yeah.
would the mind be different? The
Yeah.
brain operates the same physiological mechanisms. So if there's not the environmental pressure there, then you're going to have more disengagement. There's going to be less need to have BDNF floating around. You can turn it off. Yeah, he doesn't need it, right? Turn the brain off. Okay, so how does that what does that have to do with fantasy? What I think it has to do with it is that Stranger Things, along with a whole slew of other stories, many of which started in the 80s, or at least are being inspired by the 80s now. E.T., Neverending Story, these are all stories that start off in suburbia, but then there's something wonky going on. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden now, the all cylinders are engaged again, because we've got a threat, we've got stakes, we've got urgency, we've got monsters, we got all this weird crap happening. And the common theme is that there's an undercurrent or an underbelly of cruelty, evil, malice underneath the veneer of, the perfect suburban society. There's a lot of stories like that, especially horror. Horror loves to beat that one to death. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely in the fantasy. In Stranger Things, it's there too. In Stranger Things, they've got this perfectly normal, small town in the middle of Indiana, but there's this secret facility where there's this and all this nefarious goings on, and it's all in the dark forest. I mean, that's almost a cliche, right? But they nail it.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, it sneaks up on you like, oh, they're in the dark forest. You don't even realize it. Oh, I'm in the dark forest, like the mythic dark forest. Mm-hmm. Here we are. I didn't even notice that for several seasons and I was oh yeah, they're going into literally the dark forest to deal with this evil. So now, how does that connect with reality? I think it does in this manner. One of the themes of this season was the Satanic Panic, which they got pretty accurately. Although my wife and I both noticed that the characters in the show with the T-shirts on, like the Hellions or whatever,
Hellfire Club.
That's it, Hellfire Club. They get away with wearing those suckers, and we would not have.
No,
not in schools.
Right. Yeah.
We would have been asked to go home and change shirts. So that's maybe not entirely accurate. Although we didn't grow up in Indiana, right? We grew up in Kentucky, so a little bit more conservative. But I mean, that whole business of D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, satanic, and all that kind of stuff. And there was all those rumors about rituals and all that kind of jazz. And I don't know if you followed that at all, but it all turned out to be, for the most part, bored teenagers just stirring up crap.
Oh yeah.
They would occasionally kill animals, and they would, smear bloody messages of Satan and all that. But it's not like it was really an actual religion or anything like that. They were just listening to, acid rock and just being rebellious because they were bored.
Yeah.
They were bored and disengaged. That doesn't justify what they did, of course, but that's the scenario that they were living in, created the seeds for Vecna to emerge, which is a guy who doesn't care about anybody else. He's really just kind of bored and causing mayhem for the hell of it because he can. And he likes scaring people. He's just getting his jollies off of this kind of stuff. So that is a personification of that dark urge that this setting seems to evoke in some people. And I think part of it is because of that lack of that lack of engagement. Mm-hmm. When you create this apparently almost utopian situation, that the psyche, which is like, where is my enemy? Where is the struggle? I know it's out here somewhere, but I don't see it. Maybe I'll make up some.
Well, that's a really good point in terms of what Vecna uses in order to choose his victims.
Yeah.
Like guilt, shame, right?
Same thing with it.
So this suppression and repression, not only on a kind of mass level, but also on a micro level is happening here. And I really like what you're kind of suggesting in terms of, you know, what appears as evil, what appears as coming forward is really a means for further adaptation when it's integrated properly.
Well, it's like the rogue immune system. It's an attempted adaptation in an environment that is not matching the expectation.
Yep.
And so there's nowhere for all that energy to go. And so it ends up just running amok. Now, you could say, well, why can't we just get rid of it? Do you really want to do that?
No.
Because then that leaves us vulnerable. I mean, it evolved for a reason, right? So I don't really think there's an easy way out of this mess. But, here we are. This is the situation we have. The Satanic Panic was about, I think, really about boredom, about nihilism, feeling like, well, this isn't really any challenge. This isn't really anything to worry about. So I've got nowhere for this sort of restless force, this amorphous energy to go. And it just wound up getting channeled into this, this bad stuff.
A collective fantasy that kind of hijacks instincts, especially when they aren't being utilized.
Yeah, and they like the imagery of Satanism with the rejection of everything, right? It's just nihilism, really. It's not about anything. It's about anti-everything. Just to heck with it all, and we'll turn that into a quasi-religion, but it's not really a religion. So you just said it wasn't really a cult. It wasn't really people doing rituals to Satan with intent. It was just edgelords, pretty much. Stirring up stuff and getting off on the fact that they were just upsetting and upending the perceived norm. But there is a definite danger to that kind of stuff internally, because it leads to this sort of nihilism, and that drains away on the individual level. I think it undercuts our ability to enjoy life. It can lead to depression, all kinds of stuff like that, So it does grab a hold of you like Vecna, and it amplifies your dark thoughts and your dark memories. Remember, there's a point I really liked when Max said, I will flee to the sunlight. When she's going to challenge him mano a mano, right? Which is really courageous, given how powerful he is. And she's got a lot of her history, right? And of course, they're always going to pick the character with that kind of traumatic history to be the one that has to deal with dark entity, right? That's very common, right? So 11 on her level and Max on her level, at the human level and the superhuman level.
Right.
Yeah. And they do it in different worlds. Max does it in the real world, whereas 11 goes into the hellscape world. Makes perfect sense, because 11 is an internal figure, an internal character. There aren't actually people that can fling other people around and lift 10,000, right? So that's an internal world thing. Yeah. Thoughts?
So many.
Too many thoughts.
So many. No, I think you're onto something there. I think the kind of commentary on what was going on in the 80s and what goes on culturally now in terms of this kind of this zealous push towards kind of things to remain perfectionism. Stasis. It really it's not natural in the sense that nature is very dynamic, and there are these you're talking about the body's need to expend energy to continue to expend energy, and when it doesn't do that, it loses out on a lot of potential in essence. And I think on a kind of not only an individual but a collective level, we run the risk of just keeping ourselves in one place because we think or we're told that it is perfect and it needs to remain perfect.
Right.
But then again, nothing is. And I think Stranger Things is a perfect example of the need for a good example, right? Yeah. A good example of
nature expects imperfection.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
conflict, right? And
Yeah.
it's a tit for tat. It goes back and forth. And you need to be prepared, and you need to be willing to expose yourself to the dangers of the world in order for you to become more of yourself.
Well, I mean, think about it. If you're designing an organism, right? Say you're God and you're trying to work it out, and you say, okay, it's going to run into challenges that, the environment's going to be kind of difficult and challenging. What if I make this organism to where anytime it meets a challenge, it gets a little stronger?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's a great strategy for survival. And of course, a huge amount of biology is organized around that principle. But then you have that same organism dropped into an environment that doesn't run into any challenges.
Oh yeah.
And so then there's this impulse and instinct to get stronger, but it doesn't need to get stronger. It doesn't have anywhere to go. It doesn't have anything to do.
Yeah.
So I think they can lead to, rogue immune systems of the mind, as it were, which is kind of what Vecna is. He's kind of an autoimmune disorder of the mind, right? Which again links back to the discussion about how we are thinking that depression may very well have strong autoimmune component to it. And you certainly see it with anxiety disorders feeding into things like rash or GI upset, or any host of things. So in a sense, that Vecna and the upside down is a force within the unconscious in a traumatized individual. It's this energy that wants to destroy authentic individualism and identity. There's this hive mind aspect to him too, and crush that developing ego, which is a fate worse than death, especially for someone that age, because it's so young, it's so new, it's trying to develop. It's saying,
right,
and it's running up against this seemingly invulnerable force that says, no, you're going to be wiped out and just going to be absorbed into the hive mind, like Tyranids.
Yeah,
and,
right.
We don't want that,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. No, we
Scary
definitely don't want
stuff.
Tyranids.
No.
No. Well, orcs, the same thing. Sauron,
exactly the same thing.
Yeah,
yes.
Same thing.
Same thing. They all just follow Sauron mindlessly.
Yep. Right.
They have no real individuality to them. So I think that Stranger Things, kind of wrapping it up here, then, if I look at the big picture, it hits two beats for me. On the external side, it's a cathartic fantasy. It addresses this anomie and this sort of ennui of modern life that many people, I think, maybe even just unconsciously, feel kind of stultifying and not particularly engaging, unless they make those engagements themselves, right? A lot of people do that, right? That's what thrill seeking and adrenaline junkies and on the dark side of that is addictions. Same idea, really. And it's also the social disconnection that feeds into this too, but again, that's another conversation. But in this kind of situation, we have kind of like the war vets dreaming about going back to war and engaging in the combat and the life or death and all or nothing, and all that kind of thing. And so it's got that cathartic feature to it. And of course, a lot of people engage in that kind of stuff. It's why Call of Duty video games are so insanely popular, and they've been around forever. And it's really just the same game over and over and over again.
Yep.
With slightly different graphics, but honestly, I'm not even sure anybody's really programming those. I think there's just a big computer that's cranking them out automatically.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Anyway, I'm kidding. So you've got this in this situation, though, because they set it in suburbia, we're right there. We follow that, right? In Stranger Things, it's a dual nature. Like, so if you didn't grow up in the 80s and you're not reminded of yourself by those characters like I am, you can still get it, right? You still feel that definitely there. And that by itself would be utterly boring, because that kind of life is kind of boring. Sad to say. And of course, I realize there's things worse than being bored. But I'm just saying that does trigger these psychological reactions, right? We got to deal with it. We got to figure out what it means. But because of the fact that these evil forces are emerging, and there's mystery, and there's, you know, magic and all that kind of thing. That fires all those cylinders. It lights up the BDNF, if you were, you know, if you want to say it that way. Seeking is engaged, fear, rage, lust, care, all that stuff blasting out now. That's why it's like, oh wow, okay, so it's like, it's as if I was living my normal life, and then all of a sudden, something actually significant happened.
Right.
Holy crap, you know, wouldn't that be interesting?
Well, then that begs the question: what is normal?
Yeah.
Was the life that you were living normal, or was this?
Yeah, that's
right.
That's a tough question. Yeah, exactly. Normal compared to what?
Yeah.
Normal
right.
compared to the environment in which we evolved? No,
Nope.
not at all. It's very artificial compared to that. And this may be a consequence, not only these kinds of fantasies, but also these kinds of negative reactions and problems.
Mm-hmm.
They solve one problem, but they create another problem. You know, they solve one problem in the sense that we don't have as much murder, say, as smaller, you know, hunter-gatherer tribes, they murder each other sometimes. On a percentage scale, we have less. But is there a cost to that, or is it just a perfect, wonderful solution that has no consequences?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
you mentioned it earlier. You said it best, like depression being an indicator for things like this, right? And depression potentially being an indicator for it. I mean,
one of the sources of it. Yeah, I think so.
And we've talked about it. I know you've talked about it on your channel quite a bit. Is that, you know, when there is energy has to go somewhere, and if it's being ducted off into certain directions that might not necessarily be the most kind of satisfactory in terms of that potential, then other things might come about, right? Other things might rise to the surface that you don't necessarily want, say anxiety or depression
or nihilism or rage.
Nihilism, rage, mental health issues, right?
And that's, you know, the thing about that kind of rage, it's not even really rage in the classic sense. You're not attacking anybody. It's not in the defense of yourself or your body. It's more, it's almost kind of like an evil tricksterish kind of thing. I just want to screw up stuff and see what happens. Yeah. You know, it's very, it's nihilistic. That's what it is.
Right.
It's this nihilistic energy to just destroy, just because.
Well, you see that a lot now. You see it, and this is maybe an entirely other conversation, but I've spoken to a lot of people, and I know a lot of people, and I've personally been in the case where there is a lack of activation in life. There is this kind of nihilistic rage that just it's like, my life isn't meaningful, so therefore I need to kind of project that onto the environment and watch it kind of disintegrate to the extent where it's just like, I'm right, you know, my world needs to reflect how I feel internally, instead of identifying it as an opportunity to actually realize that that feeling in and of itself is meaningful. Yes. Right? And it's telling you something, it's trying to communicate something. So
yeah, and I think that's really the answer to that, is to recognize that it's not a mistake that you feel that way. Yeah. That there is a reason for it, and it does have meaning. So reasons are meanings, and meaninglessness, as I've said 1,000 times now, is the only thing that I think the brain can really just not tolerate. It will do almost anything to create some kind of meaning. Yeah. It's that important to the function of the brain. Yeah. And so when you engage in this, or you feel that, you know, life is not activating, as you put it, it's a good way to put it. I feel like life is not activating. A person who has previously up to that point been largely quite passive in their life will feel that anger about that, as if life is, you know, they're owed some kind of meaning on a platter from the universe. It doesn't work that way. You got to go out there and figure it out. Yeah.
Right. Engage with it authentically and engage with yourself authentically. And
yes,
I think the Hellfire Club, right? The Stranger Things kids, even though, you know, it's out of all the kids in Hawkins, right? It really could have been any of them, but maybe the reason is that, you know, they are kind of symbolic of a deeper connection with authentic unconscious to a certain degree.
And partially through, I think that's symbolized through their interest in the role-playing games, the fantasy role-playing games, which just completely took off in in the 80s, and it's been going strong ever since. Once video games developed to accommodate the role-playing genre, and all those stories, they're all very similar. We're banding a small party together of hunters to go out and seek a treasure, and it's full of monsters, and we have to fight them. It's all the same stuff.
Yeah.
It's just a primitive war band. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Or a hunting party.
Yeah.
And they're not looking for food. They're looking for treasure and magic items and all that kind of jazz. It's the same idea.
Resources.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Resources. Because that's the conflict and the challenge of life. Is the battle for resources. There's more life that can, than the resources can support, so there's going to be conflict over them.
Yeah, those don't necessarily have to be what you would consider physical ones either.
No,
be emotional.
Yeah, not for Homo sapiens, which has such a massive amount of cerebral activity. It's not just about food or sex, and that's it. There's all sorts of stuff, social capital and all that kind of thing. So that's kind of the first beat of Stranger Things for me, the cathartic fantasy on the outside. We're the characters. For me, not only am I Dustin and Mike, I'm also Hopper and Joyce Myers. I get both points of view because I remember what it was like to be their age, and being the nerdy kid involved in D&D. That was before I became super cool like I am now. And then the adults, I get that too. It triggers all of those emotions, enlivening the external world with the energizing images. Now they are taken from the inner world, which is what this whole situation is depicting internally. So the fantasy, and this is the double-faced nature of fantasy. If I take it literally, I can get lost in it. I get fascinated by the image, the way Anthony Stevens talks about. Folks in IPSA talk about that too. If you take it literally, you can get lost in that. If you don't, it's a depiction of that insidious enemy that emerges in an stultifying environment, of whether it's of your own creation or if you want to blame society, okay, whatever. But if you're feeling that way, that'll cause Vecna to emerge, potentially. A sadistic and nihilistic sort of force. Just enjoys causing pain, because for the lulls. Because it's trying to feel something. That's the thing, right? This numbness. You see this a lot in your really antisocials. And they're just doing reckless, random crap just because they feel numb. And that feeling of numbness and disengagement with life is very difficult to tolerate. And so they're going out there to create drama and chaos. They've got nothing to fight for, so they're just going to fight for nothing.
What is the poison of the Black Widow do if not kind of paralyze? It numbs. I mean, the over identification with that. And
you get caught in the web.
All
right. So the imagery of the spider is apt for that, and that may not have been conscious, but it really works. It really works because of the whole idea of getting caught in the web, and there's these tentacles everywhere that are like a web. And so Vecna is like a ginormous evil spider, like Shelob. And same idea. He turns into a giant spider. And so the idea is that you get stuck in that, you get lulled into this sort of disengaged feeling of life, and that's when you're vulnerable to attack. That's when he can take you over, choke you out, and pin you to a wall, and you're immobilized. So there it is.
There it is.
There it is. The full analysis of Stranger Things from the depth psychology point of view.
I love it. No, great conversation,
Dr. G.
Yeah, no, that was good. No, you brought up some great points that I didn't think that we were gonna kind of get into, but no, I agree. I love this series, and I thought, don't live a stultified life. Get out in the world, go on the adventure.
And I think it would absolutely. I think it would be easy to misinterpret what I'm saying as that that there's something wrong with creating a society with less violence and less crime. That's not what I'm saying.
No.
I'm simply asking, if we do that, if we get what we want, are there going to be any consequences psychologically?
Yeah.
And if there are, we need to be ready for them rather than just pretend like they're not there.
Yeah.
That's not a good plan. So,
Well, ask yourself, what is normal? What is not? What isn't normal? But I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. Is this something that I actually want, or is it something that I've been told I need to want?
yeah. And if you're feeling like you've got nothing important to do, then it's a mistake to expect the world to just hand it to you. You're going to have to do the hard work to find it. Our ancestors didn't have to have that done. They didn't have to figure that out.
Yeah.
It was given to them, whether they liked it or not. So maybe that's a better choice and maybe not. I don't know,
Right.
but here we are.
Right.
Right. And if in the ancestral scenario, you had to go out and fight, you had to go out and find food, and that was that. If you didn't do that, you were either shamed or kicked out, or you just died.
Mm-hmm.
And now we've got society created to in such a way that where it's not quite as life or death, which means you can just kind of lull about to a degree. And it's a good thing in a sense, because it means there's a safety nets and there's all, and it could be even better, really. I do advocate for that kind of thing. I'd like for us to have more safety nets, but I want to be realistic about that too.
Yeah.
And say if we have the perfect society, then we're going to have some unique problems that nobody's really talked about up to this point.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's new. It's new that we've had this much control over our environment.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll end on that then.
All right. Yeah.
We'll see everybody later.
All right. See you guys later. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye.
See you later.